Bob Harrison's weathered hands trembled around the shotgun barrel, his finger poised over the trigger as Thunder, the German shepherd who'd been his faithful companion for 7 years, gazed up at him with those impossibly trusting brown eyes from the cliff's edge. The rope around the dog's neck went slack. This wasn't supposed to be about love. Thunder took a step closer to the 300-foot drop, tail wagging weakly, as if offering himself willingly to spare his master the burden of choice. The morning wind carried the scent of pine and impending storm across Eagle's Peak, but all Bob could hear was his own ragged breathing and Margaret's dying words echoing in his memory. "Promise me you'll let Thunder live a full life." His arthritic knuckles whitened against the gun's stock. 43 years of marriage, and it had come to this, betraying the only promise that mattered to save them both from a slower death. But what if Thunder knew something Bob didn't? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Harrison Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of Colorado's high country, like a testament to 4 decades of back-breaking work, its weathered barns and split-rail fences speaking of better times when cattle prices were fair and a man's word still meant something. Bob Harrison had built this empire from nothing but determination and Margaret's unwavering faith, transforming raw mountain pasture into one of Jefferson County's most respected operations. At 68, Bob carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who'd learned early that showing weakness invited trouble. His steel-gray hair remained military short, a holdover from his Army days when he'd served as a veterinarian in Vietnam, patching up war dogs and cavalry horses under enemy fire. Those hands that now shook with arthritis had once been steady enough to perform surgery in a foxhole, guided by flashlight and prayer. Thunder had arrived 7 years ago as a 3-year-old rescue from Afghanistan, delivered by Sergeant David Chen during his brief leave before his final deployment. The dog bore the invisible scars of war. Explosive sounds sent him cowering, unexpected movements triggered defensive postures, and his eyes held depths that spoke of witnessed horrors. But Margaret had seen something special in the damaged shepherd, nursing him back to emotional health with the same patience she'd shown Bob after his own nightmares from Southeast Asia. "He's like you," she'd whispered that first night as Thunder lay trembling on their bedroom floor. "Broken, but not beyond repair." Margaret Eleanor Morrison Harrison, the banker's daughter who'd fallen for a rough-edged ranch hand, had been the civilizing force in Bob's life for 43 years. Her laugh could gentle spooked horses, her apple pie won 3 county fair blue ribbons, and her fierce loyalty had carried them through droughts, market crashes, and the slow ache of childlessness. When the cancer came 18 months ago, swift and merciless, she'd faced it with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. Thunder had sensed her illness before the doctors. He'd begin sleeping beside her bed, refusing to leave even for meals. When the pain medications left her confused and frightened, Thunder became her anchor to reality, his warm presence steadying her racing heart during the worst episodes. Bob had watched helplessly as his wife faded, but Thunder never wavered in his vigil. The veterinary bills from Thunder's car accident 6 months ago had been the final blow to Bob's already strained finances. The drunk driver who'd struck the dog while he protected the sheep from coyotes had fled the scene, leaving behind no insurance, no accountability, and a paralyzed animal whose monthly medications cost more than Bob's Social Security check. The ranch that had survived everything, market collapses, drought, even Margaret's cancer treatments, now teetered on foreclosure. Every morning, Bob would find Thunder waiting by Margaret's empty chair at the kitchen table, hope dimming a little more each day. The dog's unwavering loyalty only deepened Bob's guilt. He couldn't save his wife, couldn't save his ranch, and now couldn't even afford to properly care for the one living thing that still looked at him with unconditional love. Some promises, Bob had learned, were meant to be broken for mercy's sake. The morning that would change everything began like any other, with Thunder dragging his paralyzed hindquarters across the kitchen linoleum to his empty food bowl, the sound of his claws scraping against the floor like fingernails on Bob's conscience. But when Bob opened the refrigerator to retrieve the dog's expensive prescription food, he found instead a manila envelope that had somehow fallen behind the milk carton, forgotten in the chaos of recent weeks. His name was written across the front in Margaret's careful script, the ink slightly faded but still legible. For Bob, when Thunder needs you most. With trembling fingers, Bob tore open the envelope. Inside, folded around a small brass key, was a letter in Margaret's handwriting, dated just 3 weeks before her death. His chest tightened as he recognized her effort to write clearly, despite the morphine that had clouded her final days. "My dearest Bob," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're facing choices I pray you'll never have to make. But knowing you, my stubborn, practical husband, you're probably sitting in that kitchen counting bills and wondering if Thunder's life is worth the cost. Let me tell you what you don't know." Bob's hands shook as he continued reading, Thunder watching him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to sense the importance of the moment. "Thunder isn't just any dog, Bob. Sergeant David Chen told me the truth before he deployed that last time. Thunder was a military working dog with the 75th Ranger Regiment, specializing in search and rescue operations. He found 12 survivors in the rubble of the World Trade Center. 12 families got their loved ones back because of Thunder's nose and determination. When David died in that IED explosion, Thunder was retired with full honors, but the Army couldn't place him. His PTSD was too severe for most handlers. Bob looked down at Thunder, seeing him with new eyes. The dog's alert posture, his instinctive protectiveness, the way he always positioned himself between Bob and any perceived threat. It all suddenly made sense. "The key opens my safety deposit box at First National, box 247. Inside, you'll find Thunder's service records and something else, my mother's jewelry collection that I never told you about. I sold it last month. The account number is written on the back of this letter. $500,000, Bob. Enough to save the ranch, pay for Thunder's care, and give you both the life you deserve." Bob's vision blurred as tears he'd held back for months finally came. $500,000. Margaret had known about his financial struggles, had planned for this moment even as cancer ate away at her body. And she'd trusted Thunder to somehow guide Bob to this letter when the time was right. "I know you, Bob Harrison," the letter continued. "You're probably thinking you don't deserve this money, that you should have been stronger, should have found another way. But love isn't about deserving. It's about sacrifice. Thunder sacrificed his career and peace of mind to serve our country. I'm sacrificing my pride to serve our family. Now it's your turn to sacrifice your stubborn independence to accept help." Thunder whimpered softly, as if sensing Bob's emotional turmoil. The dog pulled himself closer, resting his head on Bob's knee with the same gentle pressure he'd used to comfort Margaret during her worst pain episodes. "There's something else you need to know," Margaret's letter concluded. "Thunder's paralysis isn't permanent. Dr. Chen at the animal hospital believes it's psychological, trauma from the accident triggering memories of explosions from his military service. With the right therapy and time, he could walk again. But even if he never does, Bob, he's already given more to this world than most humans ever will. He's earned the right to a peaceful retirement with people who love him." Bob wiped his eyes and looked at the brass key in his palm, then at Thunder's trusting face. All these months he'd seen only the bills, the burden, the constant reminder of his failures. He'd never seen the hero lying on his kitchen floor, the decorated veteran who'd saved lives and deserved better than to be viewed as a liability. The final paragraph of Margaret's letter hit him like a physical blow. "Bob, I'm dying, but Thunder doesn't have to, and neither do you. Take this gift, accept this grace, and remember that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is let others help carry the load. I love you both more than words can say. Now go save each other." Bob folded the letter carefully, slipping it and the key into his shirt pocket. Thunder's tail thumped weakly against the floor, a sound that now carried hope instead of heartbreak. For the first time in 6 months, Bob allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this story didn't have to end in tragedy after all. The drive to First National Bank should have been a celebration, but as Bob pulled into the parking lot with Thunder secured in the passenger seat, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The morning sun felt too bright. The familiar streets of Jefferson County looked foreign, and every face he passed seemed to carry judgment. He'd spent the last hour driving in circles, the brass key burning like a coal in his pocket, while his mind waged war with itself. "We don't take charity," he muttered to Thunder, who watched him with those patient brown eyes that had seen too much. 40 years I've stood on my own 2 feet. 40 years of making my own way." But Thunder's soft whimper reminded him of the stack of overdue bills on his kitchen table, the foreclosure notice that gave him exactly 12 days to produce $127,000, and the empty prescription bottle that meant Thunder's pain medications would run out by week's end. Pride was a luxury Bob could no longer afford. Inside the bank, Mrs. Patterson, who'd known Margaret since childhood, greeted Bob with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widowers. When he presented the key and Margaret's letter, her expression shifted from pity to something closer to relief. "Oh, Bob," she whispered, unlocking the safety deposit box with practiced efficiency. "Margaret made me promise not to tell you about this until you came asking. She said you'd never accept help unless you were desperate enough to need it more than you needed your pride." The box contained Thunder's military service records, as promised, commendations for valor, photographs of the dog in tactical gear, and a letter from his commanding officer praising Thunder's extraordinary courage under fire and unwavering dedication to saving human lives. But beneath the military documents lay something that made Bob's knees weak. A bank statement showing a balance of $547,132.05. "She sold everything," Mrs. Patterson explained softly. "Her grandmother's engagement ring, her mother's pearl necklace, even the china set that belonged to your great-aunt, piece by piece over the last year. She said she wanted to leave you something that mattered more than memories." Bob stared at the numbers, his vision blurring. Margaret had liquidated her family's treasures, heirlooms she'd cherished and protected for decades, to create this safety net. She'd done it quietly, without fanfare, probably during those long afternoons when he thought she was just resting. Even dying, she'd been 3 steps ahead of him, planning for contingencies he couldn't bring himself to face. "There's more," Mrs. Patterson added, her voice gentle. "Margaret left specific instructions. Half the money is for Thunder's medical care and the ranch expenses. The other half is for establishing a fund. She called it Thunder's Legacy. She wanted you to help other veterans, both human and canine, who were struggling with invisible wounds." The words hit Bob like a physical blow. Margaret had seen past his immediate crisis to something larger, something that could give meaning to Thunder's suffering and her sacrifice. She'd planned not just for their survival, but for their purpose. But as Bob walked to his truck with the banking documents secure in his jacket, the weight of Margaret's gift began to feel more like a burden than a blessing. How could he explain this windfall to neighbors who'd watched him struggle? How could he face the community knowing that his salvation had come not from his own efforts, but from his dead wife's final act of charity? Thunder seemed to sense his turmoil, whimpering softly from the passenger seat as Bob sat motionless in the parking lot. The dog's front paws scratched at the window, and for a moment Bob could swear he saw something desperate in those brown eyes. Not just concern, but urgency, as if Thunder was trying to communicate something vital that human language couldn't contain. "What is it, boy?" Bob asked. But Thunder only whined louder, his gaze fixed on something beyond Bob's understanding. The drive home became a gauntlet of familiar faces and unwanted attention. Jim Hendricks waved from his mailbox, his expression curious as he noticed Bob's unusually early return from town. Sarah Miller, Margaret's former book club friend, slowed her morning jog to stare at the truck with the kind of intense interest that meant questions would follow. Even Father Mackenzie, tending the church garden, looked up with an expectant smile that Bob couldn't bring himself to return. By the time Bob pulled into his driveway, the weight of community scrutiny felt suffocating. These people had watched him struggle for months, had seen him grow thinner and more hollow-eyed with each passing week. Tomorrow, when he paid off the foreclosure notice and Thunder's veterinary bills in full, they'd wonder where the money had come from. They'd speculate, gossip, and eventually someone would uncover the truth, that Bob Harrison, the man who'd prided himself on never asking for help, had been saved by his dead wife's secret sacrifice. Thunder's agitation reached a crescendo as they sat in the driveway, the dog pawing frantically at the door handle while making sounds Bob had never heard before, a cross between whimpering and barking that spoke of genuine distress. When Bob finally opened the passenger door, Thunder tumbled out with an awkward desperation that sent alarm bells ringing through Bob's consciousness. "Easy, boy," Bob started to say, but Thunder was already dragging himself toward the house with urgent determination, his paralyzed hindquarters working harder than Bob had seen in months. Something was wrong, terribly, desperately wrong, and Thunder knew it in a way that human senses couldn't detect. As Bob hurried after his dog, Margaret's letter crinkled in his pocket, and he realized with growing dread that salvation might have come with a price he wasn't prepared to pay. Thunder's frantic behavior led Bob straight to the kitchen, where the dog positioned himself in front of the old rotary phone on the counter and began a low, urgent whining that raised the hair on Bob's arms. The phone, Margaret's phone, the avocado green antique she'd refused to replace despite Bob's complaints about its unreliability, sat silent and still. But Thunder stared at it with the intensity of a guard dog spotting an intruder. "What's got into you, boy?" Bob asked. But even as the words left his mouth, the phone began to ring with that distinctive mechanical trill that had filled their kitchen for 30 years. Thunder's whining stopped abruptly, replaced by an alert stillness that reminded Bob unnervingly of the military photographs he'd seen in the safety deposit box. Bob hesitated before answering. In the 6 months since Margaret's funeral, he'd received exactly 4 phone calls, 2 from bill collectors, 1 from the bank, and 1 wrong number. Nobody called the Harrison Ranch anymore. Nobody had reason to. "Hello?" His voice came out rougher than intended. "Mr. Harrison, this is Nancy Rodriguez from Sunset Manor Memory Care. I'm calling about your wife, Margaret." The world tilted sideways. Bob gripped the counter for support, his knuckles white against the worn formica. "My wife is dead. She died 18 months ago. Sir, I'm looking at Margaret Harrison right here in our activity room. She's been asking for you all morning. She's having one of her clear days, and she specifically requested that we call this number." Bob's legs gave out. He slumped into Margaret's chair at the kitchen table, the same chair where she'd eaten her final breakfast, where she'd smiled weakly and told him she loved him for what he thought was the last time. Thunder pressed against his knees, offering silent support as Bob's world crumbled and reformed around this impossible truth. "That's not possible," Bob whispered. "I buried her. I watched them lower the casket. Mr. Harrison, Margaret has advanced Alzheimer's disease. She's been with us for 8 months now. According to our records, she specifically requested that her family be told she had passed away. She said she didn't want you to see her diminished." The phone slipped from Bob's nerveless fingers, clattering against the linoleum. Thunder immediately retrieved it, dropping the receiver into Bob's lap with the precision of a trained service animal. Through the earpiece, Bob could hear Nancy Rodriguez's patient voice explaining the impossible. Margaret was alive, but her mind was dying by degrees, stealing pieces of her identity with each passing day. "She made us promise," Nancy continued when Bob lifted the phone with shaking hands. "She said her husband was too good a man to waste his remaining years watching her forget his name. But today she remembers everything. Your first date, your wedding song, even the dog she made you promise to protect. She's asking for both of you." Bob's vision blurred as 18 months of grief transformed into something more complex and painful. Hope mixed with betrayal, love tangled with anger, and underneath it all, the terrible understanding that Margaret had orchestrated her own death to spare him the agony of watching her disappear. "I can't," Bob managed. "I can't see her like that. Mr. Harrison," Nancy's voice carried the weight of experience with families in crisis, "Margaret may not have many clear days left. And from what she's told me about Thunder, that dog needs to see her too. Some bonds transcend human understanding." After Bob hung up, he sat in Margaret's chair for what felt like hours, while Thunder maintained his vigil. The dog's behavior finally made sense. The way he still waited by her empty chair each morning. The way he whimpered at night when he heard Bob talking to Margaret's photograph. The way he'd grown increasingly agitated as Bob's financial situation deteriorated. Thunder had known. Somehow, impossibly, the dog had known Margaret was alive and needed them both. The drive to Sunset Manor felt like traveling through a landscape of memories. Every mile marker brought back fragments of the life Bob thought he'd buried. Margaret laughing as she tried to teach Thunder to fetch. Margaret's gentle hands bandaging the dog's paws after a particularly rough day in the pasture. Margaret's voice reading aloud in the evenings while Thunder dozed at her feet. How many of those moments had been tainted by her knowledge of what was coming? How many times had she smiled through her fear, protecting Bob from a truth she bore alone? Sunset Manor occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, its wraparound porches and gabled windows designed to evoke comfort rather than clinical efficiency. Nancy Rodriguez met them at the entrance, a compact woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone accustomed to family crises. "She's in the garden," Nancy explained, leading Bob and Thunder through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and artificial flowers. "We weren't sure if you'd bring the dog, but I'm glad you did. She's been talking about Thunder all morning, how he used to protect her from thunderstorms, how he learned to bring her medication when the pain was bad." They found Margaret on a bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree, her silver hair catching the late afternoon sunlight like spun glass. She looked smaller than Bob remembered, more fragile, but her blue eyes were clear and focused when they met his across the garden. Thunder saw her first, letting out a sound that was part whine, part sob, and pulled himself forward with desperate determination. "Thunder," Margaret whispered, and her voice was exactly as Bob remembered, warm honey over steel. "My beautiful boy, come here." The reunion between dog and woman was heartbreaking in its intensity. Thunder reached Margaret first, pressing his head against her knees while she buried her face in his fur and whispered words of love and apology. Bob stood frozen 20 feet away, watching his wife, his living, breathing wife comfort the dog they'd both thought was paralyzed as Thunder's hindquarters began to move for the first time in months. "Bob." Margaret looked up at him with eyes that held no trace of confusion or disease. "Don't just stand there like a stranger. Come hold your wife." The embrace that followed 18 months of grieving was unlike anything Bob had ever experienced. Margaret felt real and warm and heartbreakingly familiar, but she also felt precious in a way that spoke of borrowed time. Her arms around his neck, her familiar scent of lavender and determination, the way she fit perfectly against his chest. Everything was exactly as he remembered, except for the knowledge that this moment was temporary, stolen from the disease that was slowly claiming her mind. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry for making you think I was gone. But I couldn't bear for you to watch me forget you." "You should have told me," Bob's voice broke. "I should have had the choice. And you would have chosen to stay, to sacrifice everything to care for someone who wouldn't remember your sacrifice. I know you, Robert Harrison. You would have given up the ranch, your health, your future, all for a woman who was already disappearing." Thunder pressed between them, his tail wagging weakly but persistently, as if his presence could somehow bridge the gap between what was lost and what remained. Margaret's hand found the dog's head automatically, her fingers tracing the familiar patterns of his ears with the muscle memory of years of affection. "He's been taking care of you," she observed, her gaze moving between Bob's haggard face and Thunder's protective posture. "Just like I knew he would." "His legs," Bob began, but Margaret shook her head. "There's nothing wrong with his legs, Bob. Dr. Chen at the veterinary clinic has been keeping me informed. Thunder's paralysis is psychological, trauma from the accident triggering memories from his military service. He's been carrying your grief along with his own, and grief is a heavy burden for any creature to bear." As if to prove her point, Thunder stood on unsteady legs and took 3 halting steps toward a butterfly that had landed nearby. His movement was awkward, uncertain, but undeniably real. Bob stared in amazement as 18 months of assumed disability revealed itself as emotional paralysis, a dog too heartbroken to remember how to run. "The money you left," Bob said finally. "Margaret, you sold your grandmother's ring, your mother's pearls." "Baubles," Margaret dismissed with a wave of her hand. "Pretty things that never saved a life or mended a heart. The money will save the ranch and give Thunder the medical care he needs. More importantly, it will give you both a purpose. I've been thinking, Bob, about all those veterans like Thunder, human and animal, who come home from war carrying invisible wounds. What if the ranch could become a place of healing?" The vision she painted was simultaneously impossible and inevitable. Harrison Ranch transformed into a sanctuary for wounded warriors of all species, a place where broken soldiers could find peace alongside animals who understood trauma. Thunder's military service record would legitimize the operation, Margaret's inheritance would fund it, and Bob's veterinary training would guide it. "I can't do it alone," Bob admitted. "You won't be alone." Margaret's smile carried echoes of the young woman who'd agreed to marry a rough-edged ranch hand 43 years ago. "Thunder will help. And on my good days, when my mind is clear, I'll help too. We'll build something beautiful together, something that honors the sacrifices both Thunder and our veterans have made." As the sun set over Sunset Manor's garden, Bob held his wife and watched their dog take his first confident steps in months. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine. Margaret's bad days when she wouldn't recognize his face, Thunder's ongoing recovery from trauma, both physical and psychological, the enormous task of transforming a failing ranch into a healing sanctuary. But today, in this stolen moment of clarity and grace, everything seemed possible. Thunder's tail wagged with increasing confidence as he chased shadows across the grass, and Bob realized that sometimes the greatest resurrections happen not through divine intervention, but through the simple act of choosing to hope again. 3 weeks after the reunion at Sunset Manor, Bob stood at the edge of Eagle's Peak with Thunder at his side, but this time they'd come to scatter wildflower seeds. Margaret's idea during one of her increasingly rare lucid moments. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd once planned to end everything at this very spot, and now he was planting hope in the rocky soil where despair had nearly claimed them both. Thunder's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. Dr. Sarah Chen, the veterinarian who'd been quietly monitoring his case, explained that the dog's paralysis had indeed been psychological, a manifestation of survivor's guilt and trauma that had lifted the moment he was reunited with Margaret. But she'd also delivered news that changed everything. Thunder was pregnant. Pregnant? Bob had stared at the ultrasound images in disbelief. But Thunder's always been... We always thought... Thunder is female, Mr. Harrison. Military working dogs are often given masculine names regardless of gender. It's a tradition dating back to World War I. David Chen named her Thunder because of the sound her paws made during search and rescue operations. The revelation had shattered Bob's assumptions about the dog he'd lived with for 7 years. Every good boy, every masculine pronoun, every moment he'd attributed Thunder's gentle nature to unusual softness in a male dog, all of it recontextualized in an instant. Thunder had been carrying not just emotional burdens, but new life, her body protecting 5 puppies even as her mind struggled with trauma. The pregnancy explained so much. Her increased appetite despite the depression, her protective positioning around Bob during his darkest moments, her desperate attempts to communicate something beyond his understanding. She hadn't just been mourning Margaret's absence. She'd been preparing for motherhood while watching her chosen pack leader prepare to destroy them both. Now, as Bob scattered Margaret's seeds across the windswept plateau, Thunder lay contentedly in the shade of a boulder, her swollen belly visible beneath her golden coat. The puppies were due any day, and Dr. Chen had arranged for a birthing box at the ranch, complete with monitoring equipment and emergency supplies. "She's going to be a good mother," Margaret had said during her last clear day, her hand resting gently on Thunder's side as the puppies moved beneath her palm. Dogs understand love in ways we humans sometimes forget. Unconditional, protective, eternal. But Margaret's clear days were becoming shorter and less frequent. The disease that had once stolen hours now claimed entire days, leaving behind a woman who looked like Bob's wife but spoke to strangers she insisted were long-dead relatives. The staff at Sunset Manor had warned him to expect rapid decline, but nothing had prepared him for the jarring transitions between the woman he married and the confused stranger who sometimes screamed when he tried to hold her hand. The decision to move Margaret back to the ranch during her final weeks had been controversial. Nancy Rodriguez had argued for consistency and professional care, but Bob couldn't bear the thought of Margaret dying among strangers, in a place that smelled of industrial cleaning products instead of the lavender and sage she'd planted around their home. "She belongs at the ranch," he'd insisted, "with Thunder and me. If these are her last days, let them be in the place we built together." Thunder's behavior around Margaret during her confused episodes had been extraordinary to witness. The dog seemed to sense when Margaret was about to become agitated, positioning herself nearby and offering silent comfort through physical presence. When Margaret forgot Bob's name and screamed at him to leave her alone, Thunder would gently interpose herself, allowing Margaret to find comfort in stroking her fur until the confusion passed. Dr. Chen had explained this as yet another manifestation of Thunder's military training. Search and rescue dogs learn to read human distress signals that even family members miss. Thunder is essentially performing medical alert duties. She's monitoring Margaret's emotional state and intervening before crisis points. The financial transformation of their situation had been almost as dramatic as Thunder's recovery. Margaret's inheritance had not only saved the ranch but funded the beginning stages of what they were calling Thunder's Legacy Sanctuary. Bob had contacted the Veterans Administration about establishing a pilot program for PTSD therapy using military working dogs, and the response had been overwhelmingly positive. "We've been looking for exactly this kind of opportunity," Colonel James Mitchell had explained during his site visit. "The symbiotic relationship between traumatized veterans and retired military working dogs is well documented, but finding appropriate facilities has been challenging. Your ranch could serve as a model for similar programs nationwide." The irony was profound. Bob's darkest moment had revealed not just Margaret's elaborate deception and Thunder's hidden history, but a path forward that honored all their sacrifices. The ranch that had nearly been lost to foreclosure was now being retrofitted with specially designed facilities for both human and canine residents struggling with invisible wounds. But success brought its own pressures. Media attention had been relentless since word spread about the miracle dog who'd overcome paralysis to save a widowed rancher from financial ruin. Reporters wanted the heartwarming story without the complex reality of Margaret's condition or Bob's ongoing struggles with guilt and grief. "You're a hero," one persistent journalist had insisted, despite Bob's attempts to redirect credit to Margaret and Thunder. "Heroes don't plan to murder the things they're supposed to protect," Bob had replied, ending the interview abruptly. Thunder's impending delivery had become a community event, despite Bob's attempts to maintain privacy. Neighbors who'd barely acknowledged his struggles now arrived with casseroles and unsolicited advice about canine midwifery. The local newspaper wanted to document the birth as a symbol of hope and renewal, and the Veterans Administration was interested in the puppy's potential as future therapy animals. "Everyone wants a piece of the miracle," Bob confided to Thunder as they sat together on the front porch, watching the sun set over land that would soon buzz with construction activity. "But miracles aren't neat and clean like people want them to be. They're messy and complicated, and they cost more than anyone expects to pay." Thunder's response was to rest her head on his knee, her weight and warmth a reminder that some relationships transcended human complications. In the growing darkness, Bob could hear Margaret moving around inside the house, one of her restless nights when the disease convinced her that strangers had invaded her home. He should go in, try to calm her, guide her back to bed with the patient repetition that had become their nightly ritual. Instead, he remained on the porch with Thunder, stealing a few more moments of peace before returning to the exhausting work of loving someone who no longer recognized him. Tomorrow would bring more reporters, more well-meaning visitors, more decisions about Thunder's legacy and the sanctuary taking shape around them. Tonight, it was enough to sit with a pregnant dog under familiar stars and remember that some promises were worth keeping, even when keeping them changed everything you thought you knew about yourself. Thunder shifted against him, her breathing deep and steady, despite the restlessness Bob could sense in her swollen body. Labor was coming soon. Dr. Chen had warned him to watch for nesting behaviors and temperature drops. Within days, Thunder would become a mother, bringing new life into a world that had seemed determined to take everything away. From inside the house came the sound of Margaret's voice, clear and strong. "Bob! Bob, are you out there? I think the puppies are coming." Bob's heart stopped. Margaret hadn't had a lucid moment in 4 days, hadn't called him by name in over a week, but somehow she'd sensed what he and Thunder both knew. Their family was about to grow in ways that would test every assumption about love, loyalty, and the courage required to begin again. Thunder looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes that had seen war and peace, trauma and healing, despair and redemption. Her tail thumped once against the porch boards, and Bob understood. It was time to stop hiding from miracles and start living inside them, messy complications and all. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke just as Thunder's labor began in earnest, transforming what should have been a joyful moment into a desperate race against nature's fury. Rain lashed the ranch house windows while Thunder panted heavily in the birthing box Bob had set up in the kitchen, her eyes wide with a combination of pain and confusion that tore at his heart. Margaret, in one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity, knelt beside the laboring dog with steady hands that belied her failing mind. "She needs us to be calm," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd helped deliver countless ranch animals over the decades. "Dogs can sense panic, and Thunder's already frightened enough." But Bob wasn't calm. Thunder's first puppy had been stillborn, a tiny, perfect form that never took its first breath, and now complications were arising with the second delivery. Dr. Chen was trapped on the other side of the county by flooding, her cell phone calls breaking up through the static of the storm. They were alone with a dog in distress and no professional help coming. "I can't lose her too," Bob muttered, his hands shaking as he tried to remember the veterinary procedures he'd learned 40 years ago in the Army. "Margaret, I can't watch another life slip away." Thunder whimpered as another contraction seized her, her trusting eyes fixed on Bob's face with complete faith that he could somehow make the pain stop. The irony was crushing. 3 weeks ago, he'd stood at Eagle's Peak ready to end this dog's life, and now he was fighting desperately to save it. "You won't lose her," Margaret said with startling conviction, though Bob could see the confusion flickering at the edges of her awareness. "Thunder's stronger than she looks, like me." "Like you." The second puppy emerged breech, requiring Bob to carefully manipulate the tiny body while Thunder panted and struggled. His arthritic fingers, clumsy from decades of ranch work, somehow found their old precision as muscle memory guided him through the delicate procedure. When the puppy finally slipped free and took its first gasping breath, Bob felt tears streaming down his cheeks. "That's my husband," Margaret said softly, pride evident in her voice despite the disease that was stealing her memories piece by piece. Still saving lives after all these years. But their relief was short-lived. Thunder's labor stalled completely after the second birth, her body exhausted and her temperature dropping dangerously low. The remaining puppies, Bob could feel at least 2 more through her distended abdomen, were trapped, and without immediate intervention, both Thunder and her unborn offspring would die. The power flickered and went out, plunging the kitchen into darkness broken only by the emergency lantern Bob had brought from the barn. In the eerie yellow glow, Thunder's struggle took on nightmare proportions. Her breathing became labored, her responses to stimuli grew weaker, and Bob realized with growing horror that he was watching the dog who'd become his salvation slowly slip away. "We need to get her to the emergency clinic in Denver," Bob said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was impossible. The roads were flooded, his truck couldn't make it through the swollen creek that separated the ranch from the main highway, and Thunder was too weak to survive the journey, even if they could somehow reach civilization. Margaret's lucidity began fragmenting under the stress, her clear moments punctuated by confusion and distress. "Where's David?" she asked suddenly, looking around the kitchen with frightened eyes. "David was supposed to take Thunder home after the deployment. Why is she still here?" "Margaret, David died in Afghanistan," Bob said gently. "Remember? Thunder came to live with us." "No, that's not right." Margaret's voice rose with agitation. "David promised he'd come back for her. He promised." Thunder lifted her head at the mention of David's name, some deep recognition flickering in her pain-glazed eyes. For a moment, dog and woman stared at each other across the years, and the disease that separated them from their shared memories of a young soldier who'd entrusted them both with impossible promises. Bob found himself caught between two forms of dying, his wife's mind fragmenting in real time and his dog's body failing despite his desperate efforts to save her. The puppies inside Thunder had stopped moving, and he faced the terrible possibility that his surgical intervention might kill the mother to save offspring that might already be lost. "I don't know what to do," he admitted aloud, the words torn from him by exhaustion and despair. "I'm just an old man who fixes fences and feeds cattle. I'm not qualified for this." Thunder's response was to lift her head and look directly at Bob with an expression he'd seen before, the same trusting gaze she'd given him at Eagle's Peak when he'd held a gun to her head. Even dying, even in agony, Thunder looked at him with absolute faith that he would somehow find a way to save her. The decision, when it came, felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Bob sterilized his pocket knife with the last of the rubbing alcohol and made the choice every veterinarian dreads, an emergency cesarean section performed on a kitchen table with inadequate lighting and no anesthesia beyond what remained in Thunder's exhausted system. Margaret, her confusion temporarily forgotten, held Thunder's head and whispered soothing words while Bob worked. His hands moved with surprising steadiness, guided by training he'd thought forgotten and desperation that burned away his self-doubt. The first cut revealed the third puppy, alive but barely breathing. The second cut freed the fourth, stronger than its sibling and already squirming with indignant life. Thunder's vital signs grew weaker as Bob worked, her breathing shallow and irregular. He could feel her life slipping away even as he fought to save the lives she carried, and the terrible mathematics of the situation became clear. He might save the puppies, but Thunder herself was dying. "Stay with me," he whispered to the dog, who'd somehow guided him from suicidal despair to desperate hope. "Stay with me, girl. We're not done yet." Margaret's voice joined his, stronger now and clearer than it had been in weeks. "Thunder, you have to stay. Bob needs you. The puppies need you. I need you to take care of him when I can't remember how." The fourth puppy's first cry filled the kitchen with sound that seemed impossibly loud after the storm's violence. But Thunder's eyes had closed, her breathing so shallow that Bob couldn't detect it without placing his ear against her chest. He'd saved 2 lives, possibly 3. But the cost might be the one life that had taught him what love actually meant. In the flickering lantern light, surrounded by the chaos of birth and the specter of death, Bob realized that some battles are won not through skill or preparation, but through the simple refusal to surrender hope. Even when hope seems like the cruelest joke of all, Thunder's heartbeat had stopped. Bob pressed his ear against her chest, listening desperately for any sign of life while the newborn puppies mewed helplessly beside their motionless mother. The kitchen fell silent except for the storm's dying fury and Margaret's soft weeping as she cradled Thunder's head in her lap. "She's gone," Bob whispered, his voice breaking on the words. "After everything we've been through, I couldn't save her." But Margaret, her mind suddenly crystal clear in the way that sometimes happens at the edges of tragedy, began speaking to Thunder in the firm, commanding voice she'd once used with panicked livestock. "Thunder, you listen to me. David Chen didn't save your life in Afghanistan just so you could give up now. Those puppies need their mother, and Bob needs his partner. You don't get to quit on us." Bob stared at his wife, amazed by the authority in her voice, even as grief threatened to overwhelm him. Thunder remained motionless, her body cooling under his hands, but something in Margaret's tone made him try one more desperate measure. He began chest compressions, pressing rhythmically on Thunder's ribcage while Margaret continued her fierce monologue about duty and survival and the promises that bind souls together across impossible circumstances. "Come on, girl," Bob pleaded, pumping Thunder's chest with growing desperation. "Don't make me face this world without you. Don't leave me to explain to these babies why their mama gave up." For 30 seconds that felt like eternity. Nothing happened. Then, so faintly Bob thought he might be imagining it, Thunder's chest rose slightly. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused but alive, and she took a shallow, shuddering breath that was the most beautiful sound Bob had ever heard. "That's my girl," Margaret crooned, tears streaming down her face as Thunder slowly lifted her head. "That's my brave, stubborn girl." Thunder's recovery was tentative and fragile. She managed to turn her head toward her puppies, her maternal instincts overriding her physical weakness as she began the slow process of cleaning and nursing her offspring. The 2 surviving puppies, one golden like their mother, one darker with traces of shepherd markings, latched onto Thunder's milk with the fierce determination of creatures who'd fought their way into existence. Bob wrapped the stillborn puppy carefully in one of Margaret's old dish towels, unable to discard this small life that had almost cost him everything else he valued. Later, when Thunder was stable and the living puppies secure, he would bury this tiny soul beneath the dogwood tree where Margaret liked to sit during her clear moments. "She came back," Margaret said wonderingly, her fingers gentle on Thunder's ears. "She came back from death for them. For you." The implications of Thunder's near-death experience hung heavy in the storm-cleared air. Bob had performed emergency surgery on his kitchen table, delivered puppies in conditions that would have challenged a fully equipped veterinary hospital, and somehow, through skill, desperation, or divine intervention, managed to save 3 lives that had been slipping away. But the deeper revelation was just beginning to unfold. Thunder's brush with death had triggered something profound in Margaret's deteriorating mind. For the first time in weeks, she was completely present, her Alzheimer's symptoms held at bay by the crisis that had demanded every ounce of her attention and experience. "Bob," Margaret said, her voice carrying a clarity that made his heart race with hope and dread. "I need to tell you something while I still can. About Thunder. About David. About why this matters more than you know." Thunder lifted her head slightly, as if she too understood that this moment balanced on the edge between past and future, between secrets kept and truths finally revealed. The puppies nursed contentedly, their tiny bodies warm and alive against their mother's side, while outside the storm gave way to an eerie calm that promised either peaceful resolution or the eye of a larger tempest. "David Chen wasn't just Thunder's handler," Margaret began, her words measured and precise despite the exhaustion evident in her face. "He was my nephew. My sister's boy who joined the army after 9/11 and never told you because he was afraid you'd treat Thunder differently if you knew she was family." Bob felt the world shift beneath him. David Chen, the young soldier who'd entrusted Thunder to their care, who died in an IED explosion half a world away, had been Margaret's family. Thunder wasn't just a military working dog they'd agreed to foster. She was a living connection to Margaret's bloodline, carrying the genetic heritage and emotional bonds that made her practically Margaret's grandchild. "That's why Thunder understood about my condition before you did," Margaret continued, her hand never leaving Thunder's head. "She wasn't just reading my physical symptoms. She was responding to family recognition patterns that run deeper than training. Dogs know bloodlines, Bob. They know pack connections that humans miss." The revelation explained Thunder's extraordinary devotion to Margaret, her uncanny ability to sense Margaret's needs before anyone else noticed distress, and her profound grief when Margaret died. Thunder hadn't just lost a beloved caretaker, she'd lost the last tangible connection to her original handler, the soldier who'd saved her life in combat zones half a world away. "David made me promise to tell you everything if something happened to him," Margaret's voice began to waver as exhaustion caught up with her burst of clarity. "But then I got sick, and I was afraid you'd feel obligated to keep Thunder, even if she became too much burden. I wanted you to choose her freely, not from duty to a dead boy's wishes." Thunder seemed to sense Margaret's emotional state, lifting her head to nuzzle Margaret's hand with the gentle precision of a therapy animal. The gesture was so purely compassionate that Bob felt his throat tighten with unshed tears. "She chose us," Bob said finally. "Thunder chose us long before we understood what that meant." But Margaret wasn't finished. "There's more, Bob. David left something for Thunder in his will. It's been sitting in a trust account for 7 years because I couldn't bring myself to claim it. Military death benefits for his dependents. Thunder qualifies as a service animal dependent, and the trust has grown to over $200,000. Bob stared at his wife, wondering how many more secrets were hidden in the corners of their shared life. Between Margaret's hidden inheritance and David's legacy trust, Thunder's care was not just financially secure, it was abundantly funded for whatever specialized treatment or equipment she might need during recovery. "Why didn't you tell me?" Bob asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because you needed to choose love over money," Margaret replied, her clarity already beginning to fade as the crisis energy that had sharpened her mind started to ebb. "You needed to discover that Thunder was worth saving even when it cost everything. Money can't teach that lesson, Bob. Only desperation can." Thunder's breathing had stabilized, and the puppies were nursing steadily, their tiny bodies warm and secure against their mother's side. The immediate crisis had passed, but Bob could see exhaustion overtaking both Margaret and Thunder as the adrenaline that had sustained them through the emergency began to fade. "I almost killed her," Bob said, the weight of his near decision at Eagles Peak settling on him with renewed force. 3 weeks ago I had a gun pointed at her head because I thought she was suffering without purpose." "But you didn't." Margaret's voice was growing soft, her eyes beginning to lose their sharp focus. "When it mattered most, you chose love. You chose hope. You chose to be the man I married instead of the bitter stranger grief was making you become." Thunder lifted her head one more time, looking directly at Bob with an expression that seemed to encompass forgiveness, understanding, and an unshakable faith in his essential goodness. In that gaze, Bob saw reflected not the broken man who'd contemplated murder-suicide at a cliff's edge, but someone capable of performing miracles when love demanded impossible things. As dawn broke over Harrison Ranch, painting the storm-washed landscape in shades of gold and possibility, Bob sat vigil over a dog and her puppies who had somehow pulled him back from the brink of his own destruction. Thunder had taught him that some promises are worth keeping, even when keeping them transforms you into someone you never expected to become. The hardest lesson was still ahead, learning to live with hope instead of just surviving on stubbornness. 6 months later, Bob stood in the same kitchen where Thunder had almost died giving birth. But now the space hummed with purposeful activity. The 2 surviving puppies, Hope and David, named for the legacies they carried, had grown into confident young dogs under Thunder's patient guidance. Thunder herself had made a complete recovery, her earlier paralysis now seeming like a distant nightmare compared to her current role as head of therapy operations at what had officially become Thunder's Legacy Ranch. The transformation of the property had been remarkable. With the combined funds from Margaret's inheritance and David Chen's military trust, Bob had converted the ranch into a state-of-the-art facility for veterans struggling with PTSD and their canine counterparts dealing with similar trauma. The main house now included specialized therapy rooms, while new dormitory buildings provided temporary housing for veterans participating in the intensive 3-week program Dr. Sarah Chen had developed. Margaret's condition had stabilized in an unexpected way. While her Alzheimer's continued its relentless progression, the presence of Thunder and the constant activity of the ranch seemed to anchor her to the present for longer periods. She spent her good days helping with the therapy sessions, her lifetime of experience with animals proving invaluable in training both dogs and humans to trust each other again. "Mrs. Harrison has a gift," Dr. Chen explained to Bob as they watched Margaret guide a severely traumatized veteran through his first interaction with Hope, David Chen's namesake puppy. "She approaches trauma without clinical distance. These veterans respond to her authenticity in ways that formal therapy sometimes can't reach." Bob nodded, watching his wife demonstrate the breathing techniques she'd learned during her own medical struggles. Margaret's fragility had become a strange kind of strength. Her visible vulnerability gave others permission to acknowledge their own broken places without shame. The ranch had attracted national attention, but not the kind Bob had initially feared. Instead of sensationalized media coverage, they'd drawn the interest of researchers, military officials, and other veterans seeking genuine healing rather than publicity. Colonel James Mitchell had become a regular visitor, documenting the program's effectiveness for potential expansion to other locations. "What you've created here isn't just therapy," Colonel Mitchell had observed during his most recent visit. "It's a new model for how we care for the hidden casualties of war, both human and canine." Thunder's role in the program was unlike anything Bob had seen in his decades of working with animals. She seemed to instinctively understand which veterans needed gentle encouragement and which required firm boundaries. Her own history of trauma and recovery gave her a credibility that no amount of training could replicate. One morning in early spring, Bob received a call that would change everything again. Dr. Chen's voice carried an unusual excitement as she explained that Thunder's exceptional abilities had caught the attention of the Department of Veterans Affairs at the highest levels. "They want to feature Thunder in a national documentary about animal-assisted therapy," Dr. Chen explained. "But more importantly, they're offering to fund a permanent research center here. We're talking about $5 million over 10 years, Bob. Thunder's legacy could become the flagship program for veteran therapy nationwide." The offer was extraordinary, but it came with complications. National attention would mean loss of privacy, bureaucratic oversight, and the pressure to produce measurable results rather than simply helping individuals heal. Bob found himself facing a decision that echoed his earlier crisis. How much was he willing to sacrifice for Thunder's well-being and legacy? "What do you think, girl?" Bob asked Thunder as they walked the property boundaries that evening. "Are you ready to be famous?" Thunder's response was typically practical. She ignored his question entirely and focused on investigating a scent trail that led toward the memorial garden where Bob had buried her stillborn puppy. The small grave had become an unexpected focal point for the ranch's healing work, a place where veterans could acknowledge losses that couldn't be measured or replaced. Margaret's opinion, delivered during one of her increasingly rare clear moments, was characteristically direct. "Fame is just another kind of burden, Bob. The question is whether Thunder's strong enough to carry it and whether you're wise enough to protect her from the parts that might break her." The decision crystallized during a therapy session with Master Sergeant James Rodriguez, a Marine veteran who'd lost both legs to an IED and hadn't spoken to anyone in 6 months. Rodriguez sat in his wheelchair, staring at the floor, while Thunder lay patiently beside him, her presence offering silent companionship without demands or expectations. "She knows," Rodriguez said suddenly, his voice rusty from disuse. "She knows what it's like to lose pieces of yourself and keep going anyway." Thunder lifted her head at the sound of his voice, her tail wagging once in acknowledgement. The connection between traumatized veteran and traumatized dog was immediate and profound, built on shared understanding that transcended human language. "That's what matters," Bob realized, "not the research or the documentation or the national recognition. Just this. One broken soul helping another heal." He declined the documentary offer but accepted the research funding with strict conditions about privacy and autonomy. Thunder's legacy. Ranch would expand, but on their terms, with Thunder's well-being as the non-negotiable priority. The decision proved wise when Margaret's condition took a sharp turn for the worse in late summer. Her lucid moments became rare treasures, and she increasingly confused Thunder with dogs from her childhood, calling her Rusty or Belle, and expecting responses to commands the ranch dog had never learned. Thunder's response to Margaret's decline was heartbreaking to witness. The dog seemed to understand that Margaret's mind was disappearing, and she adjusted her behavior accordingly, responding to whatever name Margaret used and gently correcting dangerous behaviors without causing distress. "She's doing end-of-life care," Dr. Chen observed. Thunder's essentially serving as a memory care aid, helping Margaret navigate confusion without frustration. The end came quietly on a Tuesday morning in October. Margaret passed away in her sleep, with Thunder curled beside her bed and Bob holding her hand. Her final words, spoken clearly despite weeks of confusion, were directed at Thunder. "Take care of him for me, girl. He still needs you more than he knows." Thunder's grief was immediate and profound. She refused to eat for 3 days, stationed herself permanently beside Margaret's empty chair, and seemed to age years in a matter of weeks. Bob found himself caring for a dog whose heartbreak mirrored his own, both of them learning to navigate a world that felt fundamentally altered by Margaret's absence. The funeral drew hundreds of people, veterans who'd found healing at the ranch, neighbors who'd watched Margaret's quiet strength for decades, and military personnel who understood the significance of Thunder's service. Thunder walked beside Margaret's casket, her bearing dignified despite the visible effort it cost her. But it was during the reception afterward that the true measure of what they'd built became clear. Veteran after veteran approached Bob with stories of how Margaret's presence had made their healing possible, how her acceptance of her own vulnerability had given them permission to acknowledge theirs. "She saved my life," Master Sergeant Rodriguez said simply. "Your wife and Thunder together, they showed me that broken doesn't mean worthless." In the weeks that followed, Bob and Thunder established new routines that honored Margaret's memory while acknowledging the reality of their changed circumstances. Thunder resumed her therapy work with renewed purpose, as if Margaret's death had clarified her mission. Hope and David, now fully grown, took on increased responsibilities, allowing Thunder to focus on the most challenging cases. The ranch continued to operate at full capacity, but Bob implemented Margaret's final request, a new program specifically for caregivers struggling with the loss of those they'd cared for. The program paired grieving family members with dogs who'd also experienced loss, creating healing partnerships built on shared understanding. "Grief isn't something you get over," Bob told the first group of caregiver participants. "It's something you learn to carry gracefully. Thunder taught me that surviving tragedy isn't about forgetting what you've lost. It's about honoring those losses while choosing to keep loving anyway." As winter settled over Thunder's legacy ranch, Bob often found himself standing at Margaret's grave in the memorial garden, Thunder beside him and the puppies playing nearby. The woman who'd orchestrated her own death to spare him pain had ultimately taught him that love's greatest victory isn't avoiding loss, but finding the courage to risk everything precious again and again. Thunder's legacy had become larger than any of them had imagined, not just as a therapy dog or military hero, but as living proof that the most profound healing happens when broken souls choose to care for other broken souls, creating strength from shared vulnerability. Bob's hand found Thunder's head in the gathering dusk, and for a moment he could swear he felt Margaret's presence in the gesture, her love flowing through him to the dog who'd saved them both, the dog who'd taught them that some promises transcend death and transform everyone they touch. At 68, Bob Harrison thought his story was ending when he stood at that cliff with Thunder, his paralyzed German shepherd, ready to end both their suffering. Like so many of us in our golden years, Bob had watched his world shrink, lost his beloved wife Margaret to what he thought was cancer, faced financial ruin, and felt the crushing weight of caring for a disabled pet he could barely afford. Sound familiar? We've all been there, haven't we? That moment when love feels like burden, when practical decisions war with our hearts, when we wonder if anyone would understand the impossible choices we face daily. But Bob's story didn't end in tragedy. It transformed into something beautiful. Thunder wasn't just a broken dog. She was a decorated war hero carrying her own invisible wounds. Margaret wasn't dead. She was protecting Bob from watching Alzheimer's steal her mind. And Bob wasn't just a failing rancher. He was a healer who'd forgotten his own gifts. Sometimes our darkest moments aren't endings, they're doorways to purposes we never imagined. Thunder's Legacy Ranch now helps hundreds of veterans and their families find hope again, proving that our later years can be our most meaningful. What burden in your life might actually be a hidden blessing waiting to be discovered? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in what seemed like your darkest hour? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.